Riley Thompson lived for fall. The orange leaves, crisp air, and the smell of cinnamon spicing up every corner of her life. But this year, her excitement went into overdrive. She and her boyfriend Lucas had just moved into a small house in a rural town in upstate New York. Their cozy home, nestled between towering oaks and maples, felt like it deserved a special touch for their first autumn together. Riley envisioned pumpkins on the front porch, string lights weaving through the bare branches, and maybe even a scarecrow standing guard. The only problem? Her budget. One Saturday morning, she scrolled through her favorite online marketplace, hoping to find a deal. And that's when she found it. Fall decor for sale, $50. The ad seemed almost too good to be true. The post showed an assortment of beautiful decorations, plump pumpkins, a wicker cornucopia, delicate ceramic leaves. It looked like exactly what she needed to bring her fall vision to life. The seller's profile, however, made her pause. No profile picture, no recent activity, just the name, Mr. Kingsley, and a vague bio, clearing out old family items. Riley hesitated. She'd had her share of odd sellers before, but for this price, she was willing to take a chance. "Hey babe, I found the perfect fall decorations for the house. Only $50, and the seller says I can pick them up today." Riley called out to Lucas, who was sprawled on the couch with his laptop. "Sounds like a steal. Just be careful, yeah? There are some real weirdos out there," Lucas replied, his tone light, but his expression a bit serious. Riley rolled her eyes, grabbing her car keys. "I'll be fine. I'm just heading over there with Tessa anyway." Tessa was Riley's best friend since high school. She had a knack for turning everything into a grand adventure, no matter how small. When Riley told her about the decorations, she'd immediately volunteered to tag along. They drove through winding roads, past farmlands and stretches of forest, until they reached the address in the listing. The house that loomed before them was odd. It looked like it had once been grand, maybe even luxurious, but now it sagged and creaked under years of neglect. Large windows stared back at them, and the shutters hung crooked, as if the house were peering through half-closed eyes. Riley shivered. Tessa took one look and grinned. "It's perfect for Halloween, don't you think?" Riley forced a laugh, masking her growing unease. "Yeah, something like that." The front door opened before they even had a chance to knock, and a man stepped out. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to fixate on them. His smile was wide, but something about it felt forced. "You must be Riley," he said, his voice smooth but low. "I'm Michael Kingsley. Come on in." Riley glanced at Tessa, whose eyes were already alight with curiosity. They followed Michael into the dimly lit foyer, where the smell of old wood and something faintly rotten hung in the air. Boxes were stacked against the walls, their contents obscured by dust and shadows. "I've got the decorations in the back room," he said, gesturing down a dark hallway. Riley's pulse quickened as they made their way down the hallway. Something about the house felt off, as if the very walls were watching them. But her nerves were quickly outweighed by her excitement when they entered the back room. The decorations were even more beautiful in person, and there were more than she'd expected. Hand-painted pumpkins, a corn husk wreath, and delicate glass leaves. "This is amazing," Riley breathed. She took a step forward, reaching for one of the pumpkins. Michael's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Careful," he said, his tone harsh and his grip unyielding. His blue eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Riley felt trapped. Then he released her, stepping back and clearing his throat. "Apologies," he said, his smile returning, though it looked more strained. "Some of these items are fragile." Riley rubbed her wrist, giving a slight nod. She tried to shake off the discomfort, reasoning that he was just protective of his items. After paying, Riley and Tessa loaded the decorations into the car as quickly as they could. The sooner they left, the better. That night, Riley set up the decorations around the house, trying to shake off the unease from earlier. But as she arranged the final pumpkin on the porch, something caught her eye. Inside the hollow of the pumpkin was a folded piece of paper. Curiosity piqued, she unfolded it and found a handwritten note. "You took them. They'll find you." Chills ran down her spine. She immediately called Tessa. "You found a note? That's actually kind of spooky," Tessa said, her voice tinged with excitement. "What if it's part of some weird art project?" Riley tried to laugh, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping over her. "Yeah, maybe." But that night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every groan of the house seemed louder than usual. She tossed and turned, the words of the note replaying in her mind. In the following days, things only grew stranger. Riley began noticing subtle but unsettling changes in the decorations. The glass leaves would appear in different parts of the house, even though she hadn't moved them. One morning, she found the corn husk wreath on her bedroom floor, though she'd hung it firmly on the front door. And the pumpkins, they seemed to be rotting faster than they should, a sickly sweet smell clinging to them. Lucas noticed her unease. "Hey, what's up with you lately? You've been so jumpy." Riley tried to brush it off, but she couldn't deny the growing fear gnawing at her. Finally, she told him everything, about the house, Michael, the note. Lucas listened intently, his brow furrowing. "Maybe it's just your imagination, but we can go back and return the decorations if it's really bothering you." The thought of seeing Michael again filled her with dread, but she knew Lucas was right. She couldn't keep living in fear. That evening, they drove back to Michael's house. But when they arrived, something was terribly wrong. The house was dark, the windows shattered. It looked as though no one had lived there for years. Riley's heart pounded as they got out of the car and approached the front door, which hung loosely on its hinges. "Hello?" Lucas called, his voice echoing through the empty hall. There was no response, just an unsettling silence that filled the entire house. They walked through each room, but there was no sign of Michael, or any of the decorations he'd sold her. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners, as though no one had been there in ages. "This doesn't make any sense," Riley whispered, her voice trembling. "We were just here last week." Suddenly, a loud creak echoed from upstairs. They both froze, staring at each other. "Did you hear that?" Riley whispered. Lucas nodded, his face pale. He grabbed her hand, and together they made their way up the narrow staircase. At the top, they found a single room, its door ajar. Riley pushed it open, and her breath caught in her throat. The room was filled with photos of her, of Tessa, of their house. Each picture was marked with strange symbols, and in the center of the room lay the note she'd found inside the pumpkin. Only now it had been altered, the words scrawled in dark, angry letters. "You can't escape." A chill ran through her as she realized that Michael had been watching her all along, that he had somehow followed her even after they'd left his house. They fled the house, not looking back until they were safely inside the car. As they drove away, Riley glanced at the house one last time, just in time to see a figure standing in the window, a tall, gaunt man with piercing blue eyes. Back at home, Riley and Lucas got rid of every decoration they'd bought from Michael, throwing them into a fire pit in the backyard. But even as the flames consumed them, Riley couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly gone, that somehow they were still watching, waiting. For weeks afterward, she felt a presence around her, a cold, unsettling sensation that lingered in the corners of her home. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the man with the piercing blue eyes, waiting just beyond the shadows. No matter how many times she tried to tell herself it was over, she knew the truth. Some bargains come with a price far too high to pay. Second story, The Hiking Trail Phantom. It was October, and the crisp autumn air filled me with a sense of adventure. Living alone in the small town of Sedgwick, Oregon, I often took to hiking trails as a way to relax after work. I had recently heard about the Larkwood Reserve from a colleague who mentioned it was home to a few secluded trails and dense ancient forests. Intrigued, I decided to check it out on my next day off. The morning was cloudy, casting a dull gray light over everything as I drove the hour to Larkwood. With each mile, the landscape grew quieter, the distant mountains covered in thick pines, and the occasional red of maple trees in early bloom. The reserve parking lot was nearly empty, save for one old pickup truck parked near the edge of the woods. It was strange, given that October was peak season for hikers in Oregon, but I chalked it up to luck and strapped on my backpack, eager to get started. As I set off down the trail, I felt enveloped by the towering trees, the ground soft with damp leaves. The trail was narrow, winding between thick tree trunks, and the occasional chirping of birds or rustle in the underbrush were the only sounds I could hear. It was perfect, exactly the kind of solitude I was craving. After an hour or so of hiking, I reached Cedar Ridge, a high point overlooking a misty valley. The view was breathtaking, and I took out my phone to capture a few photos. It was then I noticed a figure standing a little way off the trail, partially hidden by the trees. She looked out of place, an older woman, perhaps in her late 50s, with short gray hair, wearing a faded blue coat. She stood unnervingly still, staring at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. Not wanting to appear rude, I gave a polite wave. She didn't respond, just continued watching me, her gaze fixed and unblinking. Unsettled, I turned back to the trail and tried to brush it off. But after a few steps, curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced over my shoulder. The woman had disappeared. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I picked up my pace, hoping to put some distance between myself and that strange encounter. But soon, I reached a split in the trail. The sign pointed one way toward Ridge Hollow and another toward a spot marked Lake Crossing. Remembering the lake mentioned on the reserve map, I turned left, hoping a change of scenery would distract me from the odd encounter. The path to Lake Crossing was even quieter than before. The only sound was my own footsteps crunching against the damp leaves. About halfway down the trail, I reached a clearing overlooking the lake. The water was still, almost too still, as if the world around it was holding its breath. As I took in the scene, a faint rustling sound broke the silence behind me. I turned, heart pounding, to find the same woman again. She stood in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, her figure half shrouded in mist, her expression eerily blank. Her eyes seemed even darker this time, and her gaze was intense, almost as if she were trying to tell me something. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. She didn't respond. Instead, she stepped backward, fading into the forest shadows. I felt a chill settle over me, the hairs on my arms prickling with a sense of danger. I told myself it was time to leave, but curiosity held me there a moment longer. Had she been following me, or was this all just a coincidence? I shook my head, trying to clear the paranoia, and made my way back toward the main trail. The further I went, the more oppressive the silence became. Even the usual rustling of animals had ceased. The trees pressed in closer, their branches casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. Just when I thought I'd lost the woman, I spotted her again, this time standing on a small bridge that crossed a narrow stream on the trail. She looked directly at me, her face expressionless, yet somehow accusing. My pulse quickened. I was done with this. I was about to call out to her again, demand to know what she wanted, but something in her gaze stopped me. It wasn't anger, it was more like grief, as if she were bearing some unspoken sorrow. Then, without a word, she turned and crossed the bridge, disappearing once again into the dense forest. I felt compelled to follow her, despite every instinct in my body telling me to turn back. But she'd vanished by the time I reached the bridge. I stopped in the middle, catching my breath, and took in the silence of the woods. A mist was beginning to rise from the trees, curling around me, thick and heavy. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, a chill that went beyond the autumn air. Finally, I decided enough was enough and hurried back toward the parking lot. The eerie encounter replayed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the image of that woman's dark, sorrowful eyes. When I reached my car, I locked the doors immediately, still feeling the weight of her gaze. The drive back was a blur, my mind racing with a mix of fear and confusion. That night, I struggled to sleep, tossing and turning as the woman's face haunted my thoughts. When I finally drifted off, I was jolted awake a few hours later by a strange sensation, like I wasn't alone. I opened my eyes to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was her, the same woman from the trail, her outline barely visible in the dark. My body froze, a wave of terror washing over me. Her face was shrouded in shadows, but her eyes seemed to glint faintly, staring at me with the same sorrowful intensity as before. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Then, as suddenly as she'd appeared, she turned and walked slowly toward the door, vanishing into the darkness. I lay there, paralyzed, staring into the shadows until morning light crept through my window. I called my mother the next day, desperate for some reassurance. As I recounted the encounter, I mentioned the woman's grief-stricken expression. My mother grew quiet, then, after a long pause, revealed something that made my blood run cold. Her sister, my aunt, had passed away that same night. I had never met my aunt. She had lived abroad for as long as I could remember. But when I saw a picture of her at her funeral weeks later, I recognized her immediately as the woman on the trail. The same haunted eyes, the same sorrowful expression. Since then, I've questioned whether I encountered my aunt's spirit, her grief lingering as she sought someone to witness her final goodbye. I haven't hiked alone since, and every autumn, I feel that same chill whenever I see a mist rising from the trees. Story 3. The Haunted House. Dare. It was a cold, cloudy October night when my friend Daniel and I decided to investigate the long-abandoned house that stood at the edge of town. We had both lived in Riverside, Oregon, our whole lives, and had heard countless eerie tales about the house since we were kids. Locals said it was haunted, cursed even. Some believed it was once owned by an old recluse who practiced witchcraft, while others whispered that a family had died there under mysterious circumstances. Either way, nobody ever dared to go near it, except for us. We'd been looking for something to do that evening, and with Halloween just a couple of weeks away, we figured it would be a perfect chance to test our courage. "Come on, let's go check it out," I said, half joking, half hoping he would refuse. But Daniel, always up for a thrill, grinned and nodded, so off we went. We packed flashlights, a few beers for courage, and, for whatever protection they might give, baseball bats from our garage. By the time we parked down the road and made our way through the darkness towards the house, the temperature had dropped noticeably. The quiet was heavy, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the cold wind breaking the silence. The house loomed in front of us as we crept up the driveway. It was massive, far larger than most homes in the area, with an architectural style that looked at least a century old. The windows were dark, with a few cracked or broken, and the front yard was a tangled mess of overgrown weeds and gnarled branches. Shadows seemed to shift in the dim light from our flashlights as we made our way around to the back, hoping to find an entry point that wouldn't attract attention. To our surprise, the back door was unlocked. Daniel gave me a questioning look, as if to say, "Are we really doing this?" I just shrugged and nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. We stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint, unidentifiable odor. The house felt frozen in time, as if someone had left abruptly and never returned. The furniture was old, covered in dust and draped with sheets, which made the place look even creepier. It was dark, save for the narrow beams of our flashlights bouncing off the walls as we explored. Every creak of the floorboards echoed ominously in the empty space. "Look at this stuff," Daniel whispered, lifting a sheet to reveal a tall, ornate mirror that was cracked down the middle. It's like stepping back in time. We decided to split up to cover more ground. I stayed on the first floor, while Daniel ventured upstairs. I wandered through a cramped hallway, my footsteps muffled on the faded carpet. Each room I peered into looked like a scene from an old horror movie. Peeling wallpaper, dusty furniture, and peculiar decorations that seemed out of place, like someone had hastily scattered them before fleeing. Then I found it, a door at the end of the hall, partially open, revealing a staircase that led down into the basement. The air that seeped up from below was colder, tinged with a strange, metallic scent. I hesitated, staring down into the darkness, but curiosity got the better of me. With one last glance back, I stepped onto the staircase, descending slowly and carefully, each step creaking louder than the last. Halfway down, I saw it, a faint orange glow filtering from around the corner at the bottom of the stairs. I stopped, holding my breath as I turned off my flashlight. There, in the darkness, I could just make out the soft, flickering light of what looked like candles. I should have turned back. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to leave, but I kept going, telling myself I had come this far already. As I reached the bottom, I peeked around the corner, and what I saw made my heart skip a beat. In the center of the room were two tall black candles, their flames flickering unevenly. Next to them was an ancient rocking chair, its fabric worn and torn, and the chair was slowly moving back and forth. Someone, or something, was sitting in it, facing away from me, with a pale, bony hand resting on the armrest. I held my breath, terrified that any sound would alert the figure to my presence. The shadows played tricks on my mind, making it seem as if the figure was looking at me, even though I knew it wasn't. I started to inch backward as quietly as possible, feeling my way along the wall. I had barely taken a few steps when one of the floorboards let out a loud creak. The figure froze. Slowly, it began to turn its head toward me, and for the first time, I could make out the pale contours of a face under the dim candlelight, an old, sunken face with hollow, staring eyes. Panic surged through me, and I turned and bolted up the stairs, not caring how much noise I made. As I reached the top, I could hear the creaking footsteps behind me. The shadowy figure was moving, following me up the stairs. "Daniel!" I shouted as I burst into the main hall, nearly tripping over myself in my rush. I sprinted toward the stairs where I had last seen him, and just as I reached the bottom, he appeared, looking alarmed. "What's wrong?" he asked, but I was too frantic to explain. "Just run!" He didn't argue. We bolted through the main hall toward the back door, not daring to look back. Just as we reached the threshold, a loud crash echoed through the house, as if something heavy had been thrown to the floor behind us. We didn't stop running until we were back at the car, panting and wide-eyed. What was that?" Daniel managed to ask, his voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to find the words to describe what I had seen. We sat in the car for a few moments, catching our breath and staring at the darkened outline of the house. Just before we pulled away, I glanced back one last time and saw the silhouette of the figure standing in the window, watching us, the faint flicker of candlelight illuminating its hollow eyes. We never spoke about what we saw that night,